Okay, so this is a deep dive into dynamic layouts, and the the impetus for this whole presentation was just sort of educational in terms of kind of looking at dynamic layouts in sort of a uh, fine-grained method and seeing exactly how it's constructed, how the CSS looks, looking at it from a front-end perspective, because there's been quite a few questions about what exactly is a dynamic layout and how it is styled and like some of the formats that we have in the skin for it, and what they all do. So I wanted to kind of get into really kind of the nitty gritty of a dynamic layout and sort of explain like what it is, what it looks like, how it's constructed, things like that. So we'll talk about the DOM structure specifically. We'll also look at the settings for the control itself that you use in Designer Studio. We'll then look at the settings that are available in the skin for any dynamic layout format and kind of talk about what those do. And then we'll look specifically at the formats that are available in the UI kit for dynamic layouts and kind of do a comparison about what's the difference between each one and what situations you'd use them for, things like that. So keep in mind this is all kind of reversed engineered. So if anybody in the audience knows any specifics, in terms of like, from a coding perspective, how all this stuff is generated, feel free to offer your insight. So this is basically me just kind of looking and seeing how different things affected the DOM and the CSS and things like that. So certainly feel free to contribute. So first off, this is the DOM structure of your typical dynamic layout. It's actually got quite a few pieces to it. Specifically, it's all mostly divs, as you can see, and it starts off with a layout div, which contains a header, which is optional, which you can either turn on or off. And then inside that header, you have three different areas. One of which, the header left, is reserved for the expand collapse icon, which we'll get into. Then header content is where your title lives, as well as any other header elements that may be present, which again we'll get into. And then there's a header right section, which actually currently isn't being used for anything, and there is no way to add anything to it apparently. I'm sure it had a purpose at one point, but as of right now, there's nothing in there. Then you have your layout body, which then has a content div in it, and then also has divs for whatever items that you drop into a dynamic layout. So if you drop in another dynamic layout, or you drop in a label or a section, or whatever other controls that you drop into a dynamic layout, they each get this content item div wrapped around it before the actual control itself is rendered. Similarly, they also get a content -x class, which the X basically represents whatever that control is. So if it's a dynamic layout, you get a content layout. If it's a label, you get content label, etc. And then you also get an item 1 and an item 2 class, or item N, essentially, that allows you to target that specific item in a dynamic layout using CSS. So we'll get into how all this is handled in there. But any questions right off the bat about this structure at all? Does it kind of make sense? Okay. So we'll talk about the settings that are available for dynamic layout control. We'll talk about the differences between a top-level dynamic layout versus a nested one, because there are actually some differences. We'll talk about the headers and the different settings available there. And then we'll also talk about the presentation tab and some of the settings that are available there and how they affect the CSS. So first off, top level versus nested. So the settings are actually different depending on whether or not the dynamic layout is the first element in a section, the outer layout of a section, versus whether the dynamic layout is nested inside another dynamic layout. So for instance, in a top level dynamic layout, you have a checkbox that says display header and title, which does essentially what you think it does. When you have it checked, it allows you to set a header for that particular layout, versus a nested layout, which has the option of setting either a header or a label. and we'll kind of get into the differences there of what those mean. Um, and then also top level layouts on the presentation tab, there's an option for floating versus the nested dynamic layout, which has an option for alignment, which kind of do the same thing, but not really. And again, we'll get into those differences. And then also top level layouts have this checkbox for self-clear, which we'll get into those as well. But I just kind of wanted to make you aware that there are differences to a dynamic layout depending on where it is in your structure or in your section. So first off, we talk about the header, which has a lot of different settings for it. They all show up in this container settings section of the first tab of the dynamic layout controls. And we kind of go through these one by one. I mean, title is pretty self-explanatory. You either get it from text or you can get it from a property reference, but they all just display whatever the actual text value is. In the case of heading levels, it basically changes the H tag, the heading tag that's in the header section. So if you select heading 4, then you're going to get an H4 tag, etc. And those correspond to your typical HTML header tags. So you get 1 through 6, and all the different out-of-the-box browser styles that you get with those tags come with it. You also have the option of including a title or an icon with a title, which you can supply an image, and then you can also supply an icon title as well, which shows up as alt text for that image. Basically what that does is it adds an image tag to the first span header element, which if you go back to the DOM structure here, you can see that it's actually this first element here that's to the left of the header title. So that just means that the icon's always going to be to the left of the header. Oops. And then for the when you're dealing with a nested dynamic layout, again, you have the option of setting either a header or a label. And if you set a label, what that does is it actually changes it to a label tag that appears outside of the whole entire dynamic layout DOM structure. It actually is a sibling that appears just before the layout class. And basically what that does is allows you to set essentially like a label that you would have for a field input level control. It's same idea there. It has a layout, a label format that you can pick from any of the label formats that are available in the skin, and it places that label just before the layout itself, as if it was a field control label. And then also header type. You have 3 different types available to you. You have bar, which is the default, which again just shows you the header as a bar across the top of the layout. You have collapsible, which adds the expand collapse icon that I mentioned earlier to the header left section, and that allows you to again collapse the body of the layout and only show the header part, or expand it to show the whole thing. And then there's also the option of field set, which I don't think is actually used terribly frequently, but it's available, so I should probably mention it. And actually what that does is it actually changes the entire the entire structure of the layout itself. So if you look here, it actually shows, so this is the layout that it would look like if it was a field set. As you can see, it's much simpler. And actually, what it does is creates a field set tag, obviously, and then has a legend instead of your header section. And then all it does is just has the title in it, and that's all that's available. And then it does a content, and then the content item, same as the regular dynamic layout. So it's a lot simpler. And basically, what that does is, if you're not familiar with field sets, is that it basically creates a box with the legend as sort of kind of in between it's sort of like overlapping the box a little bit. So instead of having the header above the box, it's actually kind of overlapping a little bit into the content area. So something to be aware of there, where it's kind of styled a little bit differently. But otherwise, it operates the same way as a regular dynamic layout. Beyond that, and then the other thing, this is something I actually just recently discovered. I don't know if this is a new feature they have added for 7.3 or what, but there's these header cells that are available to you, where they show up as the little, you may have seen it as a dotted line box that shows up in the upper right hand corner of your dynamic layout. And actually what that allows you to do is basically add a control to your header. So you can add an icon, you can add a button, you can even add another section. You can add a section included in there if you wanted to. But the cell only allows you one control, so whatever it is you put in there, that's what you get. And you can actually, I also discovered you can actually resize these by clicking and dragging on the borders. So the rightmost border or the bottom border, if you drag them, it will actually resize that particular cell and will add a inline CSS style for height and width to the header element itself. And one thing I did notice is that if you try to resize it vertically by dragging the bottom border, it does throw an error, but it still works. So I'm not quite sure what that error is about, but for whatever reason it works. And you can also add multiple cells by right-clicking on the cell and then doing an insert column, either left or right. And in this way you can actually add multiple sections to your header and throw in multiple controls that way. Unfortunately, only the column part works. If you try to insert a row or delete a row, it actually throws an error, and that one doesn't work. So you can only do one row of these header elements. And the other thing to be aware of is that they are actually floated right. So when you are looking at it in design time versus runtime, it will actually display in reverse order in runtime, because when you're floating stuff to the right, it actually it reverses the order of the items, from a left to right perspective, even though everything's floated to the right. So just something to be aware of there. So is there any questions on the header stuff? I know that was kind of a lot to take in, but
yeah. So this is Richard. The header stuff has been there for several years. So
okay.
But if you find issues with that, we should report bugs.
Okay.
This is definitely a critical function to be able to add icon in your header. So
okay.
So any of these issues should looks like bug to me. So should definitely report bugs.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, this is just me reverse engineering this stuff. So if there's anything I'm missing here, definitely let me know. Okay. So next we'll look at the presentation tab, and this is where you can set your advanced properties, your floats, things like that. Again, as we discussed, there is a difference between top-level dynamic layout and a nested dynamic layout. In the case of a top-level dynamic layout, you have the option of floating either left or right, and basically that adds a float left or float right class to the div layout, and that does exactly what you think it does. It basically floats the whole thing either to the left or to the right. For an inner dynamic layout, though, what it does is it actually adds. Well, first of all, if you select auto for the alignment option, then it doesn't do anything. But if you select right, flex end, then it actually adds an align end class to the content layout. And what that does is it actually adds a margin left of auto. And this is actually something that I just learned about in Flexbox. Is if you set the margin to auto in a Flexbox layout, it actually causes the margin to take up all available space rather than the content itself. And so the effect is essentially, by setting the margin left to auto, is that the left margin of your content takes up all the available space, and the content itself is shunted off to the right. So that's something that I wasn't even aware was a feature of Flexbox. So now I know. Now you know. So that was kind of interesting. And then there's the checkbox for set layout width to auto, which again does exactly what you think it does. It actually sets a class of set width auto to content and also to your content items, and that just makes each item in your layout, shrink to fit the width of the content that's in it. Pretty straightforward there. Then we also have under the advanced settings, we have the ability to self-clear if you're a top-level dynamic layout. And basically, what that does is it ensures that any children of your dynamic layout that are floated will stay contained inside that dynamic layout. So, if you didn't have it checked and you had something that was floated inside your dynamic layout, then there's a possibility that it might actually float completely outside of the dynamic layout entirely if you don't have any other elements in there that are not floated. That checkbox is checked by default, obviously, but you could uncheck it if you choose to. And basically that just adds a clear fixed class to your content, which basically adds pretty much all the old CSS hacks that you may have had to use in years past to make sure floats were contained inside your container, and that adds that to your dynamic layout. Whether you're a top level layout or an inner layout, they both have the option for this clear floated layouts checkbox, and that basically ensures that the layout itself clears any other floated elements that may be around it. So if you have a sibling element that's floated left, for instance, and you had this box checked, then this layout would appear below the floated element rather than next to it. And again, all that does is add a clear floated layouts class to your layout and also to your layout content. Not quite sure why they did both, but it's there in both cases. And then then you have the box for entering your custom class, your custom CSS class, which basically does exactly what you think it does. You can specify any number of custom CSS classes in this box separated by a space, and it will add those classes to your content div, not to the layout itself. So the one thing to be aware of there is that if you're setting a custom CSS class on a dynamic layout, it will only apply to your content. So you can't. I mean, you could theoretically target, like, say, the header using a sibling selector if you wanted to, but for the most part, it's mostly meant to target just your content, not the whole layout itself. And then the last thing on the presentation tab is the spacing options, and what this does is actually allows you to remove spacing that may be present in your skin format. So if you have let's say a container format that has margins in it or padding, you can use these options here to kind of remove spacing on a case-by-case basis. And so there's drop-downs for each side of your layout, so top, left, right, bottom, and each drop-down has three options. One is none, which basically means keep whatever spacing is there. Then you also have first or last item, which basically only removes the spacing for the given side for either the first item, if you're dealing with the top or the left-hand side, or the last item if you're dealing with the bottom or the right-hand side. And then the third option is all items, which, again, as you can guess, it removes the spacing from all children of your layout for that particular side. And it does that by adding this remove X spacing class, where X is the side that you're talking about, and it adds that to your content items. And basically, what that does, let's say if you had left first item selected, then it would add a remove left spacing class to the first content item in your layout, but not any of the other ones. Versus if you had all items selected, then it would add remove left spacing to all the content items. Does that make sense? Okay. Is there any other questions about dynamic layout controls, control settings specifically?
Robert, do you have any, like, in the slides, some, like, examples display-wise of what these things look like?
Just in terms of what?
So you're talking about, like, left, right, and whatnot, or the float. Do you have, like, an example of this is what it looks like rendered?
Unfortunately, no, I didn't have time to put any of that together. But
okay.
I can certainly add some in.
Yeah, that might help a little bit, because then I would understand, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah. No, okay.
Thank you.
Good point. Yeah, I'll take care of that. Any other questions? Okay. All right, so now we'll get into the actual skin formats and the settings that are available for each skin format. And we'll just kind of go through each one individually and kind of talk about how it affects the layout regardless of which format you pick. And then we can get into the actual formats that are available currently. And so to start off with, first thing right off the bat is no matter what format you pick, it adds a layout content class and a content class to your content class. And it includes the name of the layout itself. So if you have, like, say, inline grid, for instance, then your layout content would be layout content inline underscore grid or content underscore grid. I'm not quite sure why it adds both, because the layout content's the only one that ever gets referenced anywhere in the CSS that gets generated, but both classes are there for you if you need them, I guess. And then as for the options themselves, item arrangement, you have the option of selecting either inline grid or inline, and that will, in the case of inline, all that does is basically set width of auto on your content items and causes them to basically stack next to each other, because there's a flex flow of row wrap set on the div content itself, so that causes each item to kind of just naturally form a row and wrap to the next line once it hits the edge. In the case of inline grid, it actually sets a calculated width for each content item based on the number of columns that you have chosen, as well as any spacing that you may have specified in your format settings. So when you select inline grid, as you can see, it gives you the option of selecting the number of columns that you want, and then you can also specify widths for each column. Or if you want, you can check the box for proportional column width, and that will make all the columns the same width across the board. One item of note: if you select only one column to be displayed, then it will actually set a flex flow of column wrap rather than row wrap, and so that ensures that, if you set a column that's only 50% width, then the content won't wrap to have two columns instead of one, because you just want the one column, so it'll ensure that happens. And then under that, you have your label settings, which determines how labels get positioned for controls that are in your dynamic layout. And you have three options for there. For the label position, you have none, which basically hides the label completely by adding a display none to the field caption. You also have top, which adds a display block to the content inner and the field caption of your control, and it also allows you to specify spacing, the number of pixels or EM or whichever unit you want to use, but it allows you to define spacing between the label and the field. Again, because it's a display block, it'll show as a separate line above the control itself. And then for the left options, this actually is interesting to discover. It actually adds a display table to the content inner of the control, and then a table cell display to the field caption. So that is something that could probably be improved with more of a flexbox type layout in the future, but for now that's just the CSS that's being generated. And in the case of the left, you can specify either a fixed width for the label, or you can specify the spacing between the label and the field. You can't do both. So either you're going to have an automatically sized label that has a certain amount of spacing, or you're going to have a fixed width label, and those are the only options you're provided. Next we have item spacing, which is pretty straightforward. It does exactly what you think it does. It adds a margin to each content item based on what you set. You can either set the same value for all sides, or you can specify different settings for different sides, and then you can also pick your unit of measure as well. And then responsive breakpoints. Those are, you can turn on responsive breakpoints to have your layout change based on the size of the screen. And you can actually set multiple breakpoints, different screen sizes if you want. But each breakpoint has two different options. You can either say transform to other format, which allows you to select a different dynamic layout format that's available in the skin, and it will change to that format at the given screen size. And basically what that does under the covers is it copies the CSS that would normally be generated for the other format and puts it inside a media query for the existing format that you're working on. So it's not a by reference. It actually copies the whole thing at runtime. And then the other option is to hide the component, which again basically just adds a display none to your format name layout content class, and it just hides the layout completely. Any questions about these skin format settings? No? Okay.
So when you say it's dynamic about the breakpoint and it copies, so you're saying the CSS is getting generated dynamically, or is it like when it's calculated at the time when the layout is shown over there? Like the CSS will be already there, right, by default?
Yeah, so the CSS gets generated when the screen loads, like behind the scene, before it gets to the server is generating the CSS for your breakpoints at runtime. So if you have it set to transition to default, say at in this example at 768 pixels, it'll create a media query for max width of 768, and it'll basically behind the scenes it'll grab all the CSS that would be normally generated for default and copy that into this media query and then generate that and present that as the CSS available for the browser. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just need to check like when does that see. So is this part of the responsive CSS that we have?
So this, again, like I said, this is being generated by the back end essentially. So it's not anything that like is in the UI kit necessarily, but it's in the CSS generation engine essentially. And so when you
what I'm saying is the CSS which gets generated out of skin rule is I feel generated at the time when the hardness of the portal is launched, right? So is this like generated at that time, or is it like, so the user might not go to this section, but is the like format, because it's part of that, is it getting generated there? Like, just wanted to understand.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that I'm not sure of. I didn't actually look at that. But I think now that you mention it, I think it probably does get generated when the portal is launched, and is available even if you don't necessarily go to that section. Although maybe the improvements that the Sprockets team are working on to dynamically generate the CSS will change that. But for now, I think you're right. I think it might be generated at portal launch. But again, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I could very well be wrong on that. But okay, so now we'll look at the individual formats that are available currently in UIKit. As you can see, there's quite a list of them, and at some point we're hoping to be able to kind of narrow this down a little bit and kind of consolidate some of these formats, because I suspect there's some that are could probably be trimmed a little bit and duplicated. But in any case, we'll kind of look at some of the major formats that are used most often, and those can actually be broken out into 3 different categories. You have your verticals, which basically cause everything to list as a column. You have horizontal ones where everything is inline, and then you have your grid formats, which cause items to be laid out in a grid, as the name suggests. So we'll kind of look at each one in turn. So to start off with, we have your default layouts, which basically adds 14 pixels of margin to the control. Then you have stacked, which adds 7 pixels instead. And then you have simple list, which has no spacing whatsoever, but does have, and also hides the labels on any input controls that you might put in there. So the main thing to be aware of is sort of default is the most spacing, simple list is no spacing. So simple list, and because it's hiding your labels when it does that, you probably want to use simple list for laying out other like maybe nested dynamic layouts or section includes or non-input controls, I guess. Whereas default and stacked are meant for more, like fields, input fields and labels and formatted text and actual content essentially. So simple list could be seen as used for laying out other sections and layouts, and then default and stacked could be used to lay out actual content. In addition to all that, you have some formats that come with labels left, and those actually have some differences that you should be aware of. So stacked with labels left actually adds 14 pixels of padding, so it's almost exactly the same as default. The only difference is the labels are to the left rather than on top. Compare that with the regular stacked format, which only has 7 pixels of padding, and so a little confusing there, but just something to be aware of with that. And then simple list also is different than regular simple list. The ones with labels left actually has half an EM padding in there, and also notice that the size of the labels themselves is actually different. So in stacked you get 120 pixels for a label, but in simple list you only get 100 pixels. Again, not quite sure why those are different. They could probably stand to be standardized a little bit, but as of right now, that's the difference between those. And again, in either case you'd want to use, so in this case, this simple list, because it is showing the labels to the left, then you could theoretically use this for displaying actual content versus just laying stuff out. But in general, you just need to be aware of the differences between labels left versus regular formats. Any questions on any of this so far? Okay.
Thanks for showing this, because it never made any sense to me before.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of confusion about like sort of what the different choices were and sort of like what we use them for, what should we be using them for, because one of the things we're hoping to do at one point is actually do an audit of our skin and kind of identify where we can consolidate some of these and kind of standardize a lot of this stuff. So hopefully this will change in the near future to be a lot easier to deal with. But for now, it's good to kind of explain these differences and kind of show you the differences. So moving on to horizontal, these are the ones that are basically just straight inline. So they just display whatever you drop in there as a line, and they'll automatically wrap to the next line as you keep going. So right out of the box, the inline style adds 7 pixels of spacing to the bottom and the left of each particular item. Inline middle only adds spacing to the right-hand side, and the main difference between inline and inline middle is that inline middle also adds a vertical alignment of middle to each element. So if you have elements that are different sizes, then this will make sure that everything is kind of centered vertically on each given line. And then mimic a sentence is essentially it's kind of like stack, or it's kind of like simple list for inline, but not quite. It hides the labels on all your controls, and it adds a 0.3 EM spacing on the right hand side to each content item. And basically that, as the name suggests, it basically mimics a sentence and lays everything out as if it were, each control is like a word in a sentence essentially. So it includes the spacing automatically to facilitate that. And then there is the unhelpfully named split button format, which is essentially your simple list for inline, which has no spacing and no labels. And again, we could probably rename that to be a little clearer as to what it should be used for, or at least the fact that it can be used for something other than just a split button, which was probably its original intent. But those are the big four essentially on horizontal. And then same thing with the vertical layouts. You also have some that have labels left. So like inline labels left gives you, oddly enough, no spacing between items, but does give you a field label, and those labels are automatically sized, so there's no fixed width on those. I also wanted to touch on the portal header group formats that are in there, just because you could probably these would be useful to have and use in your various layouts. Unfortunately, again, they're not very helpfully named. So in the case of portal header group primary, it adds 28 pixels of padding to the right-hand side of each item, except for the first item, which only has 14 pixels, and that's actually due to a CSS override that we have in our CSS files in PyEndUser. So again, not quite sure why it's there. We may need to revisit that. So that's something to be aware of with that. And as far as portal header group secondary, that adds 14 pixels of padding to the right-hand side. I'm sorry, I've been saying padding. I mean margins. They add margins to the right-hand side. And that at least is consistent across the board. There's no CSS overrides happening there, so it is 14 pixels everywhere. And then, so those are the major ones. Is there any questions on the inline stuff? All right. And then finally, we'll look at the grid formats that are available. And again, these basically just create grids, as the name suggests. And the names themselves kind of suggest how many columns you're going to get in each of these grids. So inline grid double gives you 2 columns. Inline grid triple gives you 3. Inline grid quadruple gives you 4, etc. And each one has, 7 pixels of spacing between each item on the right and on the bottom, except for quadruple, which only gives you 6 pixels on the right and 3 pixels on the bottom. And again, I don't know why it's different. Again, probably somewhere that we could probably standardize on a little bit, but for now, that's how it works. You can actually go all the way up to, I think the columns actually give you up to 6, if I'm not mistaken. I'd have to go back and double check. So you could theoretically create a format that has 6 columns if you really wanted to, but for right now, these are the ones that are available with UIKit out of the box. We also have formats that sort of proportionally size, or not proportionally, fixed size some of the columns. So we have an inline grid 3070, which basically sets the left-hand column to be 30% width and the right-hand column to be 70% width. The one thing to be aware of with this format is there's no labels for some reason. And it only provides 7 pixels of spacing on the right-hand side of each item and no spacing on the bottom. So this looks like it was probably originally intended to lay out other sections or other dynamic layouts, versus inline grid 7030, where the labels are present, and it still has that same 7 pixel spacing on the right. But in this case, because the labels are present, then you can actually use this to display actual content. So, input controls or formatted text or things like that. Again, not sure why they're different. Probably could be standardized a little bit. We'd have to, but this one would probably be a little bit trickier to disentangle, just because, again, I think some people are probably using that first one to lay out sections versus the second one, which is meant to lay out content. So I think we may need to form some kind of clear demarcation between formats that are meant to lay out other layouts or other sections versus formats that are meant to lay out content. So we may need to separate those out somehow. But yeah, that's basically it. I actually have uploaded a spreadsheet to our folder, our box for UI Samurai, that shows every single format that's available and sort of the different settings that are currently set for each of those. So if you want to give that a look, feel free. And certainly let us know if you have any suggestions as to how we can improve these formats, or if there's any formats you think we need to add that aren't currently there. Again, let us know, and we'll see about getting those included into the UI kit. Otherwise, is there any other questions? No? All right. Well, certainly if you guys think of anything else that I may have missed, or like Paul mentioned, the examples, I can certainly add those to the presentation. I'll also upload them to this Box folder as well, so you guys can take a look. I'll also post this recording to the Mesh as well as this presentation once it's updated. And if there's nothing else, then thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thanks.